He brought his girlfriend to our anniversary dinner and announced she would be taking my position as chief marketing officer, while I focused on family. What he didn't know was that by next week, I would be introduced as the new CEO of Bennett Innovations, and his decade of undermining me would come crashing down. Let me tell you how I orchestrated the perfect corporate comeback after years of being pushed aside. Before I continue this story, drop a comment letting me know if you've ever been underestimated in your career, and don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow, I'm sharing the exact email template I used to win over the board members who had ignored me for years. The private dining room at Porter & Oak felt particularly stifling that evening, despite the restaurant's renowned ambiance and spectacular city views. I'd spent weeks ensuring every detail of our 8th anniversary dinner was perfect. Selecting Daniel's favorite vintage cabernet, coordinating with the chef for his preferred dry-aged steak, even wearing the sapphire earrings he'd given me last. Christmas. 12 years at Bennett Innovations had taught me the importance of presentation, especially when you're about to be blindsided. I watched as Daniel confidently strode through the restaurant's mahogany doors, his hand resting possessively on the lower back of his companion. Olivia Parker, our 29-year-old digital marketing manager, wore a designer dress I recognized from the company's recent Fashion Week expenditures. The irony wasn't lost on me. He was flaunting his affair using company money that I had approved in my role as CMO. "Rachel, darling," Daniel's voice carried that practiced smoothness he'd perfected in boardrooms. "I thought tonight would be perfect for an honest conversation about our future." He pulled out Olivia's chair, my chair at our traditional anniversary table, with practiced gallantry. The sommelier approached with the wine I'd pre-ordered, a 2010 Opus 1 that Daniel always insisted was the only proper choice for celebrations. He reached for the bottle with casual entitlement, as if this were just another business dinner where he was courting potential investors. But tonight was different. Tonight, every gesture, every word, every calculated move would become evidence in the corporate endgame I'd been orchestrating for months. "I've noticed things haven't been optimal between us lately," Daniel continued, his corporate jargon seeping into what should have been a personal moment. Olivia shifted uncomfortably, her perfectly manicured fingers fidgeting with an expensive watch on her wrist, a gift purchased through the executive client appreciation budget I had access to as CMO. I maintained my composure, years of navigating. Boston's competitive medtech industry finally proving useful in my personal life. "Optimal?" I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "Is that how we're describing our marriage now? In terms of quarterly results?" Daniel's smile didn't reach his eyes. It never did anymore. "Rachel, let's be practical. We've both known this was coming. Olivia represents the future of both my personal life and Bennett Innovations. The board agrees we need younger, more dynamic leadership to take the marketing division forward." What Daniel didn't realize as he sat there swirling his wine glass was that I'd spent the last 6 months preparing for this moment. Every late night he thought I was reviewing marketing campaigns. I was actually meeting with Thomas Wilson, former CEO of our biggest competitor, and the man who'd been trying to secure a partnership with Bennett Innovations for years. I was building relationships with board members who'd previously dismissed me, documenting every questionable decision Daniel had made as COO. I took a slow sip of wine, savoring both its complex notes and the knowledge of what was coming. "The future of Bennett Innovations," I mused, watching Olivia's face carefully. "That's an interesting choice of words, Daniel." The pieces were already in motion. The emergency board meeting scheduled for Monday morning wouldn't just be announcing my replacement as CMO. It would reveal the carefully orchestrated plan to restructure the entire executive team, a plan that Daniel's own arrogance had made possible when he'd insisted I join the compensation committee to keep myself occupied after our last major argument. "I've had my lawyers draw up generous divorce terms," Daniel continued, reaching into his briefcase. "Given our history, I think you'll find them more than fair." I allowed myself a small smile. In less than 72 hours, there wouldn't be anything left for him to be generous with. His position, his reputation, and his standing with the board would all belong to the people he'd pushed aside and underestimated year after year. "You know, Daniel," I said, reaching for my own briefcase, "I also have some papers I think you should see." The weight of the documents inside felt satisfying. Board meeting minutes, voting proxy agreements, and the final piece. Proof of Daniel's systematic misuse of company resources to fund his affair with Olivia and sabotage promising projects led by women in the company. The night was young, and this carefully planned anniversary dinner was about to become the beginning of something neither Daniel nor his young protege could have anticipated. Right on schedule, Thomas Wilson himself would be arriving in exactly 30 minutes. After all, what better way to celebrate the end of a marriage than by toasting to new business partnerships? Daniel was about to learn that in both love and business, underestimating your partner is the costliest mistake you can make. The maitre d' approached our table with practiced grace, carrying a sealed envelope that would set the next phase of my plan in motion. Daniel barely noticed, too engrossed in outlining his vision of Bennett Innovations' future with Olivia by his side. The restaurant's ambient lighting caught the diamond bracelet at her wrist, another corporate expense I had meticulously documented over the past months. "The wine selection this evening," Daniel announced with his characteristic pomposity, "reminds me of that product launch in Vancouver last spring." He either didn't notice or chose to ignore how Olivia's perfectly composed expression flickered at the mention of that particular trip. Of course it would. That was the weekend they'd thought they were being so discreet, not realizing that their separate business trips to the same Canadian hotel had been logged in the company's travel expenses. Porter & Oak's private dining room had always been our special place. The handcrafted walnut paneling, the curated artwork, and the wall of windows overlooking Boston Harbor had witnessed 8 years of our anniversary celebrations. Now these same elegant surroundings would bear witness to something entirely different. "You mentioned the board's support," I said, swirling the wine in my glass. The vintage's deep garnet color caught the light, reminiscent of the blood Daniel was about to watch drain from his corporate empire. "How interesting. That must have been quite a feat given the governance regulations in the company charter." Daniel's expression shifted slightly. The same micro-expression I'd seen countless times when he thought he had the upper hand in negotiations. "The board understands the need for progressive leadership," he replied smoothly. "Olivia's vision for digital transformation aligns perfectly with where we need to take Bennett Innovations." I allowed myself a small smile, remembering the late-night conversations with Thomas Wilson over the past 6 months. The irony was delicious. While Daniel had been grooming his young protege to help him seize greater control of the company, I'd been methodically preparing to reshape the entire executive structure. "Digital transformation," I echoed, watching. Olivia preened at the praise. "Is that what we're calling the systematic reallocation of company resources these days?" The maître d' chose that moment to return, this time with a vintage I hadn't ordered. "Compliments of Mr. Wilson," he announced, presenting the bottle with a flourish. The look of confusion on Daniel's face was priceless. "Thomas Wilson?" Daniel's voice carried a note of uncertainty I'd rarely heard before. "He's here?" "Oh, did I forget to mention?" I took another slow sip of wine. "I invited him to join us. I thought it appropriate given the circumstances. He should be arriving any minute now." The color drained from Olivia's face. As the marketing manager, she was well aware of Thomas Wilson's reputation as a brilliant but ruthless industry veteran. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was how I'd spent the last 6 months cultivating a relationship with Thomas that went far beyond mere industry networking. "Rachel," Daniel's voice had taken on that warning tone he used when he thought I was overstepping. "This is hardly the time or place for business discussions. We're here to discuss our personal matters." I smiled, remembering all the board meetings where he'd dismissed my input, all the company events where he'd introduced me as the wife, rather than acknowledging my role as chief marketing officer. "But darling," I replied, "isn't that exactly what you're doing? Mixing business with pleasure?" The private dining room suddenly felt smaller as Thomas Wilson's commanding presence filled the doorway. At 62, he carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from building rather than inheriting success. His silver hair and impeccable suit spoke of old money, but the sharp intelligence in his eyes revealed why he'd managed to keep his company innovative and relevant for decades. "Daniel, Rachel?" Thomas nodded cordially, pulling up a chair to our table as if he'd been invited to a friendly dinner rather than walking into the lion's den. "Olivia, you look lovely as always."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The look of barely contained fury on Daniel's face was something I'd remember for years to come. He'd spent his entire career trying to outmaneuver Thomas Wilson, never suspecting that his own wife would be the one to finally give Thomas the opening he needed. "What is this?" Daniel demanded, his corporate mask slipping to reveal the anger beneath. "This," I said, opening my briefcase, "is what happens when you underestimate the power of a woman with nothing left to lose. Particularly, one you've given access to all the company's financial records." The stage was set, the players were in position, and as I prepared to reveal the first piece of evidence that would begin Daniel's downfall, I couldn't help but appreciate the poetry of the moment. He'd brought his mistress to our anniversary dinner, thinking to humiliate me. Instead, he'd walked right into an elaborate trap that would cost him everything he'd spent the last decade building. Thomas raised his glass in a subtle toast, his eyes twinkling with appreciation for the drama unfolding before him. After all, he'd helped orchestrate every detail of what was about to happen. The next few hours would change the landscape of both our personal and professional lives forever, and not even Daniel's network of industry allies would be able to stop it. "I believe we should discuss the recent financial audit," I said, withdrawing a thick folder from my briefcase. Daniel's eyes narrowed at the Bennett Innovations logo embossed on its cover. It was the same folder he'd casually dismissed when I'd tried to bring up concerning expenditures at last month's executive committee meeting. "Rachel." Daniel's voice carried that patronizing tone he'd perfected over years of mansplaining in corporate meetings. "This isn't the time or place." "For what, Daniel?" "For discussing how company funds have been systematically misappropriated for personal expenses." I laid out the first document, a detailed expense report highlighting certain interesting patterns. Like this 5-star hotel in Vancouver booked twice for the same weekend under separate corporate accounts. Olivia's perfect composure cracked. Slightly. She reached for her water glass, her hand trembling just enough to make the ice cubes clink. Thomas Wilson leaned back in his chair, the picture of relaxed attention, as if he were watching a particularly engaging business presentation. "Those were legitimate business expenses," Daniel snapped, his fingers drumming against the fine linen. "Tablecloth. The board approved standard travel expenses," I interrupted smoothly. "They didn't approve matching his and her spa treatments, or the private villa with the infinity pool, or the vintage champagne delivered to room 512, a room booked under the company's marketing budget. Isn't that right, Olivia?" The young woman's face had lost its rosy glow. She looked uncertainly at Daniel, who was now glaring at the documents, as if he could make them disappear through sheer force of will. "You've been going through confidential company records," he accused, trying to regain control of the situation. "That's a breach of—" "Board members have full access to all financial records," Thomas interjected mildly. "It's in the charter. Harold Bennett wrote when he founded the company. Article 7, Section 3, if I'm not mistaken." He smiled, taking an appreciative sip of his wine. "Excellent vintage, by the way. ashamed to waste it on such uncomfortable conversations. I withdrew another document from the folder. Speaking of uncomfortable conversations, let's discuss the recent restructuring of the marketing department. Particularly interesting how several experienced employees were let go to make room for new hires, all personally selected by our young marketing manager here. Olivia straightened in her chair, attempting to project professional confidence. Those personnel changes were necessary for the department's modernization strategy. Modernization strategy, I repeated thoughtfully. Is that what we're calling it when qualified professionals are replaced by your former sorority sisters, all of whom, coincidentally, received salaries well above industry standard? Daniel's face had taken on a dangerous red tinge. You're overstepping, Rachel. The board will be very interested in reviewing these findings, I cut in, laying out more documents. Especially the part about how company funds were used to purchase luxury items like this watch, logged as client appreciation gifts, but currently adorning your companion's wrist. Olivia instinctively covered the watch with her other hand, her eyes darting between Daniel and the damning paper trail I was creating on the table. You've certainly been thorough, Thomas commented, examining one of the reports with professional interest. Impressive attention to detail. Reminds me of how Harold Bennett used to audit his managers. Trust but verify, he always said. Daniel's jaw clenched at the mention of the Bennett name. If you think you can use some creative accounting to... Creative accounting? I laughed softly. Oh no, darling. Everything here is documented with perfect accuracy. Every expense, every authorization, every signature, including yours on these forms authorizing business development trips that coincidentally matched Olivia's personal vacation posts on Instagram. I slid my phone across the table, showing a carousel of Olivia's social media posts, pristine beaches, intimate candlelit dinners, luxury hotel suites, each image paired with a corresponding company expense report. You've been stalking my social media? Olivia's voice cracked slightly. Stalking implies secrecy, I corrected. Your posts are public, something a marketing manager should probably know about privacy settings. Though I suppose actual marketing expertise wasn't the primary qualification for your position. Daniel slammed his hand on the table, making the crystal glasses jump. Enough! Whatever you think you're doing. What I'm doing, I said calmly, is demonstrating a pattern of corporate misconduct that the board won't be able to ignore, especially not with the company's potential future partner as a witness. I nodded toward Thomas, who raised his glass in acknowledgement. You brought Wilson into this? Daniel's voice was deadly quiet now. Do you have any idea what you've done? Created a partnership opportunity, Thomas suggested helpfully. Though partnership might not be the right word, given how cooperative your wife has been. The realization finally dawned in Daniel's eyes. He looked at me with a mixture of fury and dawning comprehension. You've been working with Wilson Medical. Let's just say Thomas and I share an interest in proper corporate governance, I replied, and in seeing Bennett Innovations return to the ethical standards Harold Bennett established. By selling out to our biggest rival? Daniel's voice rose incredulously. No, Daniel, I corrected him. By ensuring the company's legacy isn't destroyed by your inability to keep your personal and professional lives separate. The maitre d' approached again, this time carrying a laptop. As requested, madame, he said, setting it up at the end of the table. The screen flickered to life, showing a video conference window with familiar faces. The other members of Bennett Innovations' board of directors. I hope you don't mind, I said to Daniel's increasingly pale face. But I thought the board might want to join us for this discussion. After all, transparency is one of our core corporate values, isn't it? I excused myself from the table with practiced elegance, leaving Daniel to face the board members whose pixelated faces now filled the laptop screen. The ladies' room at Porter & Oak was exactly as I remembered it. all marble fixtures and hand-painted silk wallpaper. A fitting place to pause and savor the beginning of Daniel's downfall. In the ornate mirror, I studied my reflection. The black, Armani dress I'd chosen for tonight, purchased with my own money, not company funds, suddenly felt like armor. Not a hair out of place, not a smudge in my carefully applied makeup. The woman staring back at me looked composed, controlled, and utterly dangerous. Tonight wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was about reclaiming power that had been slowly stripped away over 8 years. I took out my phone, checking the series of texts that had been quietly arriving throughout dinner. Everything was proceeding according to schedule. Legal team standing by from Thomas's corporate counsel. Board members all logged in, from his executive assistant. Financial documents prepared for distribution from the forensic accounting team. My hands were steady as I reapplied my lipstick, the same shade I'd worn to my first executive meeting, when Daniel had patronizingly suggested I just sit and observe. If only he'd known then that every dismissive comment, every condescending gesture was being filed away for future reference. The bathroom door opened, and Olivia slipped in, her confident facade crumbling around the edges. She started when she saw me at the mirror, clearly having thought she'd find refuge in an empty powder room. "Feeling overwhelmed?" I asked mildly, watching her reflection. It's understandable. Corporate restructuring can be so stressful, especially for those caught in the crossfire. "I never meant," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to continue. The young woman who'd so confidently taken my seat at the anniversary dinner now looked very much her age. "Never meant what?" I turned to face her directly. "Never meant to sleep with a married man? Never meant to help him misappropriate company? Funds? Never meant to get caught? You'll have to be more specific." She gripped the marble countertop, her knuckles white. "Daniel said everything was above board. The expenses, the promotions, all of it. He said as COO. As COO, he has a fiduciary duty to the company and its shareholders," I completed for her. "A duty he's been negligent in fulfilling, as the board is now discovering." I studied her face. "Tell me, did he promise to make you the youngest chief marketing officer in company history?" The flash of recognition in her eyes confirmed my suspicion. "That position was supposed to be announced next month," she whispered. I smiled, remembering a similar promise, made to me years ago. Daniel has a habit of making promises with things that don't belong to him. The company, its resources, its future. None of it was ever truly his to give away. My phone buzzed again, another update from Thomas's team. The preliminary board vote was proceeding exactly as we'd anticipated. Daniel's carefully constructed world was unraveling thread by thread in the dining room, while his young protégé stood trembling in the ladies' room, facing the consequences of her choices. "What's going to happen now?" Olivia asked, her voice small. I checked my watch, an elegant Patek Philippe that Daniel had given me for our 5th anniversary. "In about 20 minutes, the board will call for an emergency session to address the evidence of financial misconduct. By tomorrow morning, trading of Bennett Innovations stock will be temporarily suspended. By next week, the company will have new leadership." I met her eyes in the mirror. "As for you, well, that depends on how cooperative you're willing to be." "Cooperative?" "Thomas Wilson is an excellent businessman," I explained, touching up my powder. "He understands the value of young talent when properly managed and ethically guided. Your actual marketing skills, separate from your relationship with Daniel, could be an asset to the new executive team. Assuming, of course, you're willing to provide a full statement about Daniel's misuse of company resources." "Understanding," dawned in her eyes. "You're offering me a way out?" "I'm offering you a choice," I corrected. "More than Daniel ever did." He saw you as an accessory to his midlife crisis, a way to feel powerful and young again. I'm seeing you as what you could have been if he hadn't corrupted your potential for his own ego." My phone buzzed once more, Thomas requesting my return to the dining room. The board had reached their preliminary decision, right on schedule. "Take a moment to fix your makeup," I advised Olivia, moving toward the door. "Then think carefully about where your loyalty lies, with a man who's about to lose everything, or with your own future." The weight of my grandmother's locket felt heavy against my chest, the same locket I'd worn when I first met Daniel at that MedTech conference 10 years ago. Inside was a small photo from our wedding day, a reminder of what we'd once been and what he'd thrown away for the illusion of youth and power. As I walked back toward the dining room, my heels clicking purposefully on the marble floor, I thought about the long game I'd been playing. 6 months of careful planning, of quiet meetings with Thomas, of documenting every indiscretion and financial irregularity. Daniel had always underestimated me, had never bothered to look beyond the surface of the corporate wife role he'd assigned me. His mistake had been forgetting my background in corporate finance, forgetting that I'd once specialized in mergers and acquisitions before he'd convinced me to step back from my career for the sake of our future family. A family that never materialized. Now those same skills would be his undoing. I paused outside the private dining room, hearing Daniel's raised voice through the heavy door. He was undoubtedly trying to regain control of the situation, to charm or bully his way out of the trap I'd set. But it was too late. The machinery I'd set in motion was far beyond his ability to stop. Taking a deep breath, I prepared to return to the table. The next phase of my plan was about to begin, and I wanted to savor every moment of Daniel's realization that he'd not only lost his marriage, but the career he'd spent a decade building. Sometimes the perfect revenge requires patience, precision, and the ability to see 10 moves ahead. Daniel was about to learn that he wasn't the only one who knew how to play corporate chess. As I returned to the private dining room, the atmosphere had shifted palpably. Daniel was standing now, his carefully maintained composure cracking as he attempted to address the board members on the video conference screen. "This is nothing but a misunderstanding," he was saying, his voice carrying that false confidence I'd heard so many times in difficult board meetings. "These expenses were all properly authorized." "By you," I interrupted smoothly, retaking my seat. "Which becomes problematic when those authorizations show a clear pattern of personal benefit." I withdrew another set of documents from my briefcase. "Speaking of patterns, shall we discuss the recent changes to the company's procurement policies?" Thomas Wilson leaned forward with interest while Daniel's face darkened. The procurement changes had been his pet project, pushed through during a board meeting I was supposedly unable to attend due to a family emergency, an emergency he had fabricated. The procurement restructuring was necessary for operational efficiency, Daniel stated flatly, but I could see the concern in his eyes. He knew exactly what I'd found. "Operational efficiency," I repeated thoughtfully. "Is that what we're calling it when all major contracts are mysteriously redirected through companies owned by Olivia's family members?" Through the laptop screen, I could see several board members exchanging alarmed glances. Daniel's hand tightened on his wine glass. "The Parker family has a long history in supply chain management," he began, but I cut him off. "The Parker family didn't exist in supply chain management until 6 months ago," I corrected, laying out registration documents for several newly formed companies. Interesting timing, considering that's when Olivia's brother suddenly decided to leave his career as a personal trainer to become a procurement specialist. Olivia, who had quietly returned to the table, looked as though she might be sick. Her brother's involvement had clearly been meant to remain hidden. "Those contracts were awarded based on merit," Daniel insisted, but his voice had lost its authoritative edge. "Merit?" I raised an eyebrow, sliding another document across the table. "Like this contract for medical equipment that's priced at 3 times the market rate?" Or perhaps we should discuss the consulting fees being paid to a company registered under your girlfriend's mother's maiden name. The board members on the screen were now leaning forward, their expressions a mixture of shock and growing anger. Daniel had always counted on their disengagement, their tendency to rubber stamp his decisions. He hadn't counted on someone actually reading the fine print. "You've been investigating me," he demanded, anger finally overtaking his professional mask. "No, darling," I smiled. "I've been doing my job as a board member, the same job you insisted I take because, what was it you said? It'll give you something to occupy your time while I handle the real business." Thomas Wilson chose this moment to add his perspective. "The board might also be interested in how these inflated contracts have affected Bennett Innovations' market competitiveness. My analysis suggests the company has been operating at a significant disadvantage due to these unusual procurement arrangements." Daniel's head snapped toward him. "You have no right to access our—" "Actually," I interrupted, "I provided Mr. Wilson with all this information. As a board member, it's my duty to investigate any situations that might harm the company's interests. Having our potential future partner verify my findings seemed prudent." I gestured to the maitre d', who approached with another envelope. "Which brings us to the most interesting discovery." I withdrew a single document, the smoking gun I'd been saving for this exact moment. "Would you like to explain why Bennett Innovations has been paying rent on a luxury penthouse that doesn't appear in any official company records?" The color drained from Daniel's face. The penthouse had been his secret, a love nest paid for with company funds but hidden through a complex series of internal accounts. "That's confidential company," he began, but one of the board members on screen cut him off. "Mr. Miller, are you saying you were aware of this property?" The question came from Jennifer Chen, the board's most senior member and a close friend of Harold Bennett. Daniel's silence was damning. I continued, my voice carrying clearly to the video conference. "The penthouse lease, registered under a variation of Olivia's middle name, has been paid for using funds allocated to executive retention programs. A rather ironic choice of classification, wouldn't you say?" Through the screen, I could see Jennifer removing her glasses and pinching the bridge of her nose, a gesture I'd seen many times when she was particularly disappointed. "Daniel, please tell me this isn't what it appears to be." But Daniel couldn't tell her that, because it was exactly what it appeared to be. A systematic misuse of company resources to fund his affair, all while believing his position as COO made him untouchable. "I think," Thomas said into the heavy silence, "this might be a good time to discuss the offer I've prepared for the board's consideration." And there it was, the moment when Daniel finally understood the true extent of what was happening. This wasn't just about exposing his indiscretions or his financial misconduct. This was about taking everything. The look he gave me was one I'd remember forever, a mixture of rage, disbelief, and dawning comprehension that he had severely underestimated the woman he'd dismissed as nothing more than a corporate trophy wife. The perfect revenge isn't just about exposing secrets. It's about using those secrets to dismantle an empire piece by carefully documented piece. "Before the board reviews Mr. Wilson's offer," I said, reaching for a final set of documents, "I think we should discuss how we arrived at this moment. After all, context is everything." Daniel's face had taken on the ashen quality I'd seen only once before, the day Harold Bennett had suffered a heart attack in the middle of a board meeting. That day had changed everything, shifting power dynamics that had held steady for decades. "Do you remember that day, Daniel?" I asked, laying out a photograph from Harold's last board meeting. "The day you convinced the board that Harold's temporary absence required an immediate transfer of voting control?" Several board members on the screen shifted uncomfortably. That hastily called emergency session had been the beginning of Daniel's transformation from dutiful protege to ruthless COO. "Harold's health required immediate action," Daniel snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. The company needed stable leadership. Stable leadership, I echoed. Like how you stabilized the situation by having Harold transferred to a private care facility 2 states away? The same facility that mysteriously restricted all visitors except immediate family? Thomas Wilson leaned back, watching the drama unfold with keen interest. He, better than anyone, understood the weight of legacy in corporate politics. You isolated Harold Bennett, I continued, my voice carrying to every corner of the private dining room. Kept him away from board members who might question your decisions, all while systematically dismantling the ethical framework he'd spent decades building. Olivia looked between Daniel and me, clearly realizing she was witnessing the unraveling of a story much deeper than a simple marital betrayal. That's ancient history, Daniel attempted to dismiss, but Jennifer Hartford's voice cut through the video feed. Is it, Daniel? Because I've been trying to visit Harold for months. Your assistant always has some excuse about his treatment schedule or doctor's orders. I withdrew another document from my folder. Perhaps this might interest you, Jennifer. Medical reports from Harold's care facility showing he's been deemed fully competent to make business decisions for the past 18 months. Daniel's hand jerked, knocking over his wine glass. The red liquid spread across the white tablecloth like blood, a fitting metaphor for the evening's revelations. Those are corporate medical insurance records, I corrected, accessible to any board member reviewing executive benefits. You really should have read the company bylaws more carefully, darling. I turned to address the board members directly through the screen. Harold Bennett built this company on principles of integrity and innovation. He taught these values to everyone he mentored, including Daniel. But somewhere along the way, Daniel decided those principles were outdated, that they were holding the company back from modernization. Harold's management style was becoming obsolete, Daniel interjected desperately. The market was changing, I acknowledged. But Harold's ethical standards weren't obsolete. They were inconvenient. Inconvenient for your plans to restructure the company. Inconvenient for your desire to use corporate resources as your personal piggy bank. Inconvenient for your affair with a subordinate half your age. I laid out another photograph, this one from Harold's retirement party. Daniel and Harold stood side by side, both beaming with pride. Harold Bennett welcomed me into the company that day. He spent hours telling me stories about the company's history, about the principles it was built on. He made me promise to help protect the legacy he'd built, a promise you've clearly broken. You've broken that promise, Daniel snarled, but I could see the fear behind his anger. No, Daniel, I'm keeping that promise today. Harold knew the temptations that came with corporate power. He tried to protect you from them, to guide you, but you chose a different path. I gestured to Thomas Wilson. Do you know why I chose to work with Thomas specifically? Because Harold and Thomas were actually close friends before your aggressive acquisition attempts drove them apart. Another piece of company history you never bothered to learn. Thomas nodded solemnly. Harold always said integrity was the foundation of good business. He would be disappointed to see how that foundation has been undermined. The revelation seemed to stun Daniel. Momentarily silent, I used the opportunity to drive home the final point. Everything that's happening tonight, the exposure of your misconduct, the evidence of your mismanagement, the potential partnership with Wilson Medical, it's all because you forgot the fundamental lessons Harold tried to teach you about integrity, about responsibility, about the true meaning of legacy. I could see the board members on screen nodding, particularly Jennifer Chen, who remembered Harold's leadership style. Harold isn't just alive and well, I continued, my voice carrying the weight of 8 years of accumulated knowledge. He's been watching everything you've done to his company. Every ethical compromise, every misuse of funds, every betrayal of trust. I've made sure he's received detailed reports of everything. Daniel's face went from ashen to scarlet. "You've been reporting to Harold?" Someone had to keep him informed about what was happening to his life's work. And now, thanks to those medical reports clearing him for business activities, he'll have a voice at Monday's board meeting. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, not as his wife, not as a board member, but as the architect of his downfall. I had played the long game, building relationships, gathering evidence, and waiting for the perfect moment to reveal how thoroughly he had betrayed not just me, but the entire Bennett legacy. Sometimes the most devastating revenge isn't just about exposing current misdeeds. It's about revealing how those misdeeds are part of a larger pattern of betrayal that stretches back years. The stage was set for the final phase of revelations, and Daniel was about to learn just how much damage could be done by underestimating a woman who had spent 8 years learning every detail of his business. 1 week later, I sat in the CEO's office, my office now, looking out over the Boston skyline. The morning's news had finally died down. Bennett Innovations announces new leadership. Historic partnership with Wilson Medical finalized. Former COO steps down amid financial misconduct allegations. Olivia had provided a full statement to the board in exchange for a modest position in the restructured marketing department. Harold Bennett had been welcomed back as chairman emeritus, his wisdom and experience once again valued. And Daniel had been offered a choice: resign quietly with a minimal severance package, or face a very public investigation. He chose the former, of course. Men like Daniel always choose self-preservation in the end. The intercom buzz interrupting. My thoughts. "Ms. Miller, the transition team is ready for you in the conference room," my new assistant announced. I smiled, still getting used to hearing my maiden name again. Reclaiming my identity had been the first step in rebuilding myself after Daniel's betrayal. "Thank you, Amanda. I'll be right there." I gathered my tablet and the strategy document I'd been reviewing. The merger with Wilson Medical was proceeding smoothly, but there was still so much work to be done. As I stood, I caught my reflection in the window, confident, powerful, finally in the position I deserved. The woman staring back at me barely resembled the one who had sat across from Daniel at Porter & Oak just 7 days ago. The conference room fell silent as I entered, all eyes turning toward me. Around the gleaming walnut table sat the new executive leadership team, a diverse group of talented individuals who had been overlooked or pushed aside during Daniel's tenure. Thomas Wilson sat at the far end, now representing our largest strategic partner. "Good morning, everyone," I said, taking my seat at the head of the table. "Let's talk about the future of Bennett Innovations." The meeting proceeded efficiently, each department head presenting their integration plans. The synergy between our two companies was already exceeding projections, our combined research capabilities promising breakthroughs that neither company could have achieved alone. This was what Harold Bennett had envisioned all along: collaboration rather than cutthroat competition. After the meeting, Thomas lingered behind. "Impressive work, Rachel," he said, his eyes crinkling with genuine warmth. "Harold would be proud." "It's only been a week," I reminded him. "The real work is just beginning." "True, but you've accomplished more in 7 days than Daniel did in years." He hesitated, then added, "Speaking of Daniel, have you heard from him?" I shook my head. "Not since he cleared out his office. His lawyers are handling everything now." I kept my voice neutral, professional. The time for emotions had passed. "How's Harold settling back in?" "Like he never left," Thomas chuckled. "He spent 3 hours in the R&D lab yesterday, questioning assumptions and challenging the research team to think bigger, just like the old days." A notification appeared on my tablet, an email from Jennifer Chen confirming the updated company charter had been filed with the appropriate regulatory bodies, another piece falling into place. "The board meeting went well?" Thomas asked, noticing my small smile. better than expected. The governance changes passed unanimously. I'd spent countless hours crafting those changes, new checks and balances, to prevent anyone from accumulating the kind of unchecked power Daniel had wielded. We're implementing a more transparent structure, with clearer reporting lines and conflict of interest policies. Smart, Thomas nodded approvingly, building safeguards into the system itself. My phone buzzed with a text message from Samantha, Kelly, my former assistant who had been instrumental in gathering evidence against Daniel. She'd been promoted to Director of Operations in the restructuring, a position she'd earned through years of exceptional work, but had been repeatedly denied under Daniel's leadership. Investors responded well to the announcement, I told Thomas, checking the latest stock updates. We're up 12% since the merger news broke. The market appreciates decisive leadership and clear vision, Thomas replied. Two things that have been lacking here recently. As we walked toward the elevator, I noticed Olivia Parker working in one of the glass-walled meeting rooms, earnestly explaining something to a small team. Our eyes met briefly, and she gave a small, uncertain nod of acknowledgement. I nodded back. Her choice to cooperate had proven valuable, and her marketing skills were genuinely impressive when not corrupted by Daniel's influence. Everyone deserved a second chance, as long as they earned it. Will you be attending the industry conference next month? Thomas asked as we reached the lobby. Absolutely. It's time Bennett Innovations reclaimed its position as an industry leader. I extended my hand. Thank you again for your partnership, Thomas. I know this wasn't the traditional merger you'd envisioned. He smiled, clasping my hand firmly. Sometimes the best outcomes come from unexpected circumstances. Harold and I have been trying to find a way to work together for decades. It took someone with your particular motivation to make it happen. After Thomas departed, I took a private moment in the memorial garden behind the building, a tranquil space dedicated to Harold's late wife. The autumn air was crisp, leaves turning gold and crimson on the maple trees Harold had insisted on planting when the headquarters was built. It was here, 6 months ago, that I'd first run into Thomas Wilson. He'd been visiting the garden out, of respect for his old friend's wife, unaware that Harold had been effectively exiled from the company he built. Our conversation that day had planted the seeds for everything that followed. My phone rang, Harold Bennett himself, calling from his newly reinstated office on the executive floor. Rachel, my dear. His voice was strong despite his 78 years. I've been reviewing the R&D proposals. Brilliant work. This collaboration with Wilson's team is exactly what the industry needs. Thank you, Harold. That means a lot coming from you. I've always believed in giving credit where it's due, he said pointedly. Something my former protege seems to have forgotten along the way. I smiled at his diplomatic phrasing. Harold had been devastated to learn how Daniel had manipulated the board and isolated him from the company. But like me, he'd channeled that pain into purpose, working tirelessly since his return to help rebuild what Daniel had nearly destroyed. The board has approved the new ethics committee, I told him. I'd like you to chair it if you're willing. I'd be honored, Harold replied. It's about time we formalize those principles into governance structures. As we discussed the details, I found myself reflecting on how differently things might have turned out if Daniel had simply treated me with respect, as a partner rather than an accessory. His betrayal had been painful, but it had also freed me from the constraints of a relationship that had been holding me back for years. Oh, and Rachel, Harold added before ending our call. Jennifer mentioned you're considering reinstating the mentorship program for young executives? Yes, with a particular focus on developing talent that's been historically overlooked in our industry. Excellent. That's exactly the kind of long-term thinking we need. I could hear the pride in his voice. You know, when I first brought Daniel into the company, I thought I was securing the future of Bennett Innovations for the next generation. It appears I was right, just not in the way I expected. After we ended the call, I walked slowly back, toward the main building, taking in the campus that now fell under my leadership. Employees nodded respectfully as I passed, some still adjusting to the dramatic changes of the past week. Near the main entrance, I spotted a familiar figure, Michael Rodriguez, the board member who had been the first to support my evidence against Daniel. He was engaged in animated conversation with our newly promoted head of engineering, a brilliant woman who had nearly left the company after being passed over for promotion 3 times under Daniel's leadership. "Rachel," Michael called out, waving me over. We were just discussing the proposed expansion of the research facility. "Perfect timing," I joined them. "I've just approved the preliminary budget this morning." As we walked inside together, discussing the details of the expansion, I couldn't help but notice how naturally I'd stepped into this role. A role I might never have sought if Daniel hadn't pushed me into a corner, forcing me to fight not just for my career, but for my dignity. Later that afternoon, I met with the company's PR team to finalize the announcement of our new direction. The sleek conference room buzzed with energy as the team presented their plans for repositioning Bennett Innovations in the marketplace. "We want to emphasize the return to the company's core values," the PR director explained, while highlighting the innovative partnership with Wilson Medical, a blend of tradition and forward thinking. "Perfect," I nodded, reviewing the materials. "And the internal communications plan?" "We've developed a comprehensive approach to help everyone understand the new structure and reporting lines," she continued, displaying a series of presentation slides. "Transparency is key to rebuilding trust after the recent turbulence," a diplomatic way of referencing the upheaval caused by Daniel's sudden departure and the revelations about his misconduct. "I'd like to add a town hall meeting," I suggested. "Give employees a chance to ask questions directly. No filters, no prepared statements, just honest answers." The PR director looked momentarily alarmed. That could be risky, considering the circumstances. "Yes," I agreed, "but necessary. This company has had enough secrets and backroom deals. Moving forward, we lead with transparency, even when it's uncomfortable." After approving the final communications plan, I headed back to my office to prepare for a call with our international division. The corner office that had once been Daniel's had been completely redecorated. Gone were the dark leather and mahogany fixtures he'd preferred, replaced with a lighter, more modern aesthetic that maximized the natural light from the floor to ceiling. Windows. I paused at Amanda's desk. "Any messages?" "Just one." She handed me a small envelope. This was delivered by courier about an hour ago. The envelope bore no return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. Inside was a single key, the key to our former home, and a brief note. "Signed the papers. House is yours. D." A surprisingly civilized gesture from a man who had lost everything through his own arrogance. Perhaps there was a glimmer of the person I'd once loved still somewhere inside him. Or perhaps it was simply another calculated move to salvage whatever he could from the wreckage of his reputation. Either way, it was closure of a sort. I slipped the key and note into my desk drawer as Amanda announced my international call was ready. The business of running Bennett Innovations continued, regardless of personal dramas. The video conference connected, revealing our team in London. "Good afternoon, everyone," I greeted them, easily shifting back into CEO mode. "Let's discuss the European market integration plan." That evening, as I finally prepared to leave the office, I found Harold waiting by the elevator. His familiar tweed jacket and bow tie a comforting sight amid so much change. "Working late, Rachel?" he asked, his eyes twinkling with the same sharp intelligence that had built Bennett Innovations from a small research lab into an industry leader. "There's so much to do," I admitted. "The transition team has identified several legacy projects that need immediate attention." "Ah, yes. Daniel had a habit of abandoning initiatives when they didn't show immediate results." The elevator arrived, and we stepped in together. "You know, Harold said as we descended. "I've been thinking about our conversation this morning, about the mentorship program." "Yes?" "I'd like to be more directly involved. Perhaps give a series of talks to the new leadership cohort about the company's history and founding principles." I smiled, touched by his enthusiasm. At 78, most men would be enjoying retirement, not diving back into corporate education. That would be invaluable, Harold. These young executives need to understand where we came from to help shape where we're going. Exactly, he nodded emphatically. Too many of our recent problems stemmed from forgetting the core values that built this company. As we reached the lobby, Harold paused, his expression growing more serious. "You know, I owe you an apology." "Rachel." "For what?" "For not seeing what was happening sooner. For allowing Daniel to isolate me from the company to the point where I couldn't protect what I'd built, or the people who were loyal to it." I shook my head. "You have nothing to apologize for, Harold. Daniel manipulated everyone, including the board. What matters is that you're back now, helping rebuild." "Yes, well?" He straightened his bow tie, a gesture I'd come to recognize as his way of composing himself when emotional. "I've learned an important lesson from all this. Never underestimate the quiet ones watching from the sidelines. They might just be the ones saving your life's work when you least expect it." We walked together to the parking garage, discussing plans for the upcoming quarter. Despite the long day, I felt energized rather than exhausted, a marked contrast to how I'd felt in the final months of working under Daniel's leadership. "Will you be joining us for dinner on Friday?" Harold asked as we reached his car. "Thomas is bringing his wife, and Jennifer mentioned she'd like to discuss the new board committee structure in a more relaxed setting." "I wouldn't miss it," I assured him. The informal dinners with key stakeholders had become an important tradition. In just the short weeks since the leadership change, a way to build genuine relationships beyond the boardroom. As Harold drove away, I stood for a moment in the quiet garage, taking a rare moment to simply breathe and reflect. 1 week ago, I'd been preparing for a dinner that I knew would end my marriage, but had hoped would salvage my career. I could never have imagined that I'd be standing here now as CEO, with the company undergoing the most significant positive transformation in its history. My phone buzzed with a text from Samantha. "Finished the audit of international subsidiaries. Found some interesting patterns in the Milan office. Can we discuss tomorrow?" "Absolutely." 9 a.m. my office, I replied, making a mental note to review the Milan operation reports before our meeting. Daniel's web of financial improprieties apparently extended further than we'd initially discovered. I drove home, not to the suburban house I'd shared with Daniel, but to a sleek downtown apartment I'd secretly leased 2 months ago when I'd realized the marriage was beyond saving. The space was still sparsely furnished, but it was mine, untainted by memories or betrayal. As I kicked off my heels and poured a glass of wine, I allowed myself a moment of pride. Not just for the professional victory, but for finding the strength to stand up for myself when it would have been easier to simply walk away with the generous settlement Daniel had offered. The penthouse windows offered a panoramic view of Boston Harbor, lights twinkling on the water. Somewhere across that harbor, Daniel was likely nursing his wounded ego, perhaps already plotting his comeback. But he would find the industry landscape dramatically changed. The Whisper Network had done its work. Everyone knew why Daniel Miller had really left Bennett Innovations, despite the carefully worded press release about pursuing other opportunities. My phone rang again. Thomas Wilson, likely with an update about the regulatory filings for our partnership. "Rachel?" His voice confirmed my guess. "Just wanted to let you know the SEC filing is complete. We're officially partners." "That's excellent news, Thomas. Ahead of schedule, even." "Indeed. My legal team sends their compliments on the thoroughness of your documentation. Apparently, it's some of the cleanest merger paperwork they've seen in decades." I smiled, taking a sip of wine. 8 years of watching Daniel cut corners taught me exactly what not to do. Thomas chuckled. A valuable education, in its way. Oh, and before I forget, Harold mentioned you might be selling the house? Yes. Too many memories. Why do you ask? My daughter's family is relocating to Boston next month. They've been looking for something in that neighborhood. Would you be open to a private sale? Save you the trouble of listing it. That sounds perfect, actually. One more clean break from my past with Daniel. Have your daughter call me directly. I'll make sure she gets a fair price. After ending the call, I opened my laptop to check the final email of the day, a message from our largest institutional investor, confirming their support for the new leadership team and increased stake in the company. The market was responding even better than we'd projected to the announced changes. I closed the laptop and walked to the window, wine glass in hand. In the reflection of the glass, I could see both the city lights and my own image superimposed over them, the skyline and the woman who had claimed her place within it. The journey from that anniversary dinner at Porter & Oak to this moment had been the most challenging week of my life, but also the most transformative. In attempting to discard me for a younger model, Daniel had inadvertently freed me to become something more powerful than he could have imagined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, of course. The merger integration would require careful management. The culture Daniel had created, one of fear, favoritism, and opacity, would take time to reform. And there were undoubtedly more financial irregularities waiting to be discovered in the international offices. But for tonight, I allowed myself to simply appreciate the view, both literally and figuratively. I had reclaimed not just my career, but my sense of purpose and self-worth. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect New England autumn day. I arrived at the office early, wanting time to review the Milan documents before my meeting with Samantha. The Bennett Innovations campus was quiet at this hour, just a few dedicated employees already at their desks. I nodded to the security guard as I passed through the lobby, noticing he was reading an industry publication with our merger announcement prominently featured on the cover. The headline read, "Bennett-Wilson Partnership Signals New Era in Medical Technology." The article contained several quotes from analysts praising the strategic vision behind the partnership. A far cry from the coverage Bennett had received in recent years under Daniel's leadership, which had increasingly focused on missed targets and questionable business decisions. My office was exactly as I'd left it the night before, the morning sun streaming through the east-facing windows. I settled at my desk and opened the secure file Samantha had sent regarding the Milan operation. What I found confirmed my suspicions. The Italian subsidiary had been used to channel funds through a complex series of transactions that ultimately benefited a small holding company. Further investigation revealed that holding company was registered to none other than James Parker, Olivia's father. I was still reviewing the documents when Samantha arrived promptly at 9 a.m., carrying a stack of additional files and a look of determination on her face. "Good morning," I greeted her. "I see our friend was even more creative with company resources than we initially thought." Samantha nodded grimly, taking a seat across from me. The Milan operation was just the tip of the iceberg. We've identified similar patterns in our Singapore and Dubai offices. She laid out the additional files, each containing evidence of Daniel's elaborate network of financial impropriety. What had begun as simple expense account abuse had apparently evolved into a sophisticated system of self-dealing that spanned multiple countries. The total misappropriation appears to exceed $12 million, Samantha concluded, and that's just what we've documented so far. I leaned back in my chair, processing the implications. Does the board know? Jennifer Chen has been briefed on the preliminary findings. She suggested we complete the full forensic audit before presenting to the entire board. A wise approach. The revelation of this level of misconduct would necessitate reporting to regulatory authorities, something that, while necessary, would need to be handled with care to minimize impact on the company's reputation and stock price. Agree with Jennifer's recommendation, I said. Let's bring in the external auditors from Deloitte. I want an independent verification of everything we've found. Samantha made a note. Already scheduled for Monday. There's one more thing you should know. She hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. Go ahead. The Dubai transactions. They don't match Daniel's usual pattern. The documentation is different, the routing more sophisticated. I think he had help. Olivia? I suggested, thinking of her business degree and family connections. Samantha shook her head. No, someone with more experience. I found traces of email correspondence with Martin Green. The name hit me like a physical blow. Martin Green had been Daniel's mentor in his early days at Bennett Innovations, the man who had taken him under his wing after Harold's health issues began. Martin had retired 3 years ago with considerable fanfare and a generous package. Martin taught Daniel everything he knew, I murmured, pieces falling into place, including, apparently, creative accounting. It seems that way, Samantha agreed. The methods used in Dubai match tactics from some projects Martin oversaw before his retirement. This complicated matters significantly. Martin Green still had friends on the board and considerable influence in the industry. If he was implicated in financial misconduct, the fallout could be messier than anticipated. Thank you for bringing this to me directly, I told Samantha. For now, let's keep this between us, Jennifer, and the external auditors. Document everything meticulously, but keep the circle small until we know exactly what we're dealing with. After Samantha left, I sat quietly, considering the implications. The mentorship connection between Martin and Daniel suggested the problems at Bennett Innovations might have deeper roots than any of us had realized. What had started as an effort to expose Daniel's betrayal and reclaim my position was revealing systemic issues that predated both of us. I picked up my phone and called Thomas Wilson. Rachel, good morning, he answered promptly. How can I help? I need your perspective on something, I explained. How well did you know Martin Green during the years you and Harold were friends? There was a pause on the line. Martin was complicated, brilliant financial mind, but Harold and I disagreed about his methods. Why do you ask? We're finding some concerning patterns that may trace back to his tenure. I'd value your insights, but discreetly. Of course, I'm free for lunch if you'd like to discuss in person rather than over the phone. Perfect. The usual place at 12:30? I'll be there. I ended the call and immediately dialed Harold. Bennett. If anyone would have insights into Martin Green's history with the company, it would be the founder himself. Harold answered on the second ring. Rachel, what a pleasant surprise. Harold, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important? Not at all, my dear. Just reviewing some old research notes. What can I do for you? I chose my words carefully. I'm looking into some historical financial structures within the company, particularly around international operations. Martin, Green's name has come up, and I realized I don't know much about his early years with Bennett Innovations. A lengthy silence followed. When Harold finally spoke, his voice had lost its usual warmth. I see. Perhaps this is a conversation better had in person. Are you free this afternoon? I can make time whenever works for you. 4 o'clock, my office. And Rachel, he paused. You might want to bring Jennifer Chen to this meeting. The gravity in his tone confirmed my growing suspicion that we had stumbled onto something significant. Perhaps something Harold himself had suspected but never been able to prove. I'll see you at 4, I confirmed, immediately sending a text to Jennifer to clear her schedule. The morning proceeded with a series of executive team meetings, reviewing integration timelines and addressing the inevitable questions that arose from merging two complex organizations. Throughout, part of my mind remained focused on the looming conversations about Martin Green and the potential implications for Bennett Innovations. At 12:15, I left for my lunch with Thomas, walking the short distance to the small French bistro we'd come to favor for our more sensitive conversations. The restaurant's private back room offered both excellent food and complete discretion, essential for the industry's top executives. Thomas was already seated when I arrived, nursing a sparkling water and reviewing documents on his tablet. "Rachel?" He stood to greet me with a warm handshake. "Always a pleasure." After we ordered and the waiter had left us in privacy, Thomas leaned forward. "So, Martin Green. That's a name I haven't heard in quite some time. What can you tell me about him, particularly his relationship with Daniel?" Thomas took a thoughtful sip of his water. Martin joined Bennett Innovations about 25 years ago, brought in to modernize the financial operations as the company expanded internationally. Harold trusted him implicitly, perhaps too much so. "And you didn't share that trust?" A rueful smile crossed his face. "Let's just say Martin and I had different philosophies about business ethics. Nothing I could ever prove definitively, but there were deals during his tenure that always seemed a bit too favorable to Bennett, especially in emerging markets." "When Harold became ill," I prompted, "Martin took on more responsibility?" "Yes, and that's when he really took Daniel under his wing. Daniel was young, ambitious, and impressionable. The perfect protege for someone like Martin who valued results over methods." Our salads arrived, providing a momentary pause in the conversation. "What exactly has prompted this sudden interest in ancient history?" Thomas asked, once we were alone again. I weighed how much to share with our new partner. Thomas had proven trustworthy throughout our carefully orchestrated takeover of Daniel's position, but this went beyond personal grievances into potentially serious corporate governance issues. "We've uncovered some financial irregularities in our international offices," I said finally. "The pattern suggests they may have originated before Daniel's leadership, possibly during Martin's tenure, with Daniel simply continuing established practices." Thomas set down his fork, his expression grave. "That complicates things considerably. If these are long-standing structural issues rather than just Daniel's personal misconduct." "Exactly. We may be looking at a more extensive cleanup than anticipated. The question is how far back it goes and how many people were involved." "Have you spoken with Harold yet?" "Meeting him at 4, with Jennifer Chen joining us." Thomas nodded slowly. "Good. Harold needs to be part of this conversation, difficult as it might be for him. Martin was his friend long before he was his CFO." "Do you think Harold knew?" I asked the question that had been bothering me since Samantha's revelation. Thomas considered for a long moment. "I don't think he knew specifics. But Harold is a brilliant man. He may have had suspicions he chose not to investigate too closely, especially as his health declined." The implication hung heavily between us. If Harold had indeed turned a blind eye to questionable practices established by his trusted CFO, that complicated the narrative of returning to the company's core ethical principles. "What would you do in my position?" I asked finally. "Exactly what you are doing," Thomas replied without hesitation. "Follow the evidence methodically, involve only those who need to know, and prepare for difficult conversations. The company's long-term health depends on addressing these issues thoroughly, regardless of where or to whom they lead." Our lunch concluded with a discussion of how this might impact the merger integration, but Thomas reassured me that his support remained unwavering. "Wilson Medical entered this partnership with eyes open," he reminded me. "Every company has skeletons. It's how the new leadership addresses them that matters." I returned to Bennett Innovations with renewed determination. If Martin Green had indeed established questionable practices that Daniel had merely continued, that didn't excuse Daniel's behavior, particularly his personal misuse of company funds and his betrayal of our marriage. But it did suggest the problems ran deeper than one man's ethical failings. The afternoon passed quickly with back-to-back meetings, until finally it was time to meet Harold and Jennifer. I gathered the key documents Samantha had provided, placing them in a secure folder, and headed to Harold's office on the executive floor. Harold's space was much as I remembered it from years ago, walls lined with books and industry awards, comfortable leather chairs arranged for conversation rather than intimidation, and everywhere evidence of his lifelong passion for medical innovation. Models of groundbreaking devices developed under his leadership were displayed prominently alongside family photos and mementos from his lengthy career. Jennifer Chen arrived moments after I did, her usual composed demeanor showing hints of concern. As one of the company's longest-serving board members and Harold's close friend, she understood better than most the potential ramifications of what we were about to discuss. "Thank you both for coming," Harold began once we were settled with tea. "Rachel, why don't you start by telling us exactly what you found?" I outlined the discoveries from the Milan, Singapore, and Dubai offices, explaining the patterns Samantha had identified and their similarities to financial structures established during Martin's leadership. Harold listened intently, his expression growing increasingly troubled. When I finished, he removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose, a gesture I recognized as signaling deep distress. "I was afraid of this," he said finally. "Not the specific methods you've described, but the general possibility that Martin's influence extended beyond his retirement." "You suspected?" Jennifer asked gently. Harold nodded slowly. "There were inconsistencies in some reports during my last years as active CEO. Nothing I could definitively prove, especially as my health was failing and Martin had assumed many of my responsibilities. By the time I was strong enough to investigate properly, Daniel had already orchestrated my effective removal from day-to-day operations." "And Daniel learned these methods from Martin?" I prompted. "Almost certainly. Martin always saw something in Daniel, a protege he could mold in his image. I had hoped Daniel's natural intelligence and the values I tried to instill in him would prevail, but..." Harold trailed off, the personal disappointment evident in his voice. Jennifer leaned forward. "Harold, we need to discuss how to proceed. This goes beyond Rachel's discovery of Daniel's personal misconduct. If these practices are systemic and long-standing, our regulatory disclosure obligations become much more complex." "I understand," Harold nodded grimly. "The company I built must be transparent, even if that means acknowledging failures during my own leadership." His willingness to accept responsibility, even for actions taken by those he had trusted, reminded me why Harold Bennett was so respected in the industry. It was this integrity that had made Bennett Innovations great in the first place, and what Daniel and Martin had apparently abandoned in pursuit of short-term gains. "I suggest we expand the external audit immediately," I said, "but keep this information contained to the four of us, Samantha Kelly and Thomas Wilson, until we have the complete picture." Jennifer nodded in agreement. "The merger documentation gives us some cover for conducting an extensive review of all operations. We can frame the initial investigation as standard due diligence." "And Martin?" Harold asked quietly. "He's retired, but still serves on several industry boards, if he was indeed the architect of these systems." The question hung in the air, laden with personal and professional implications. Martin Green wasn't just a former executive. He was Harold's longtime friend, someone who had stood by him during his illness, who had been trusted with the company's financial future. "One step at a time," I suggested gently. "Let's confirm the extent of the issues before deciding how to handle individual accountability." As our meeting concluded, I found myself in the unexpected position of comforting the man who had built Bennett Innovations from nothing, the man whose legacy we were all working to protect. "Harold," I said as Jennifer stepped out to take an urgent call, "I want you to know that this doesn't diminish what you built. Every company faces challenges, ethical lapses. What matters is how we address them." He smiled sadly, suddenly looking every one of his 78 years. "Thank you, my dear. You know, when I first welcomed you to Bennett Innovations, I told Daniel he was a fortunate man to have found someone with both brilliance and integrity. It appears I was right about one of you. The simple compliment carried the weight of years of observation, making it all the more meaningful. We'll get through this, Harold. The company will emerge stronger. Yes, he agreed, his natural optimism reasserting itself. But I fear the path forward may be more complicated than any of us anticipated when you first showed me those expenses from Daniel's affair. As I left Harold's office, I realized he was right. What had begun as a personal mission to expose Daniel's betrayal and reclaim my professional standing had evolved into something far more significant, a fundamental reckoning with the company's past and a chance to rebuild its future on a truly ethical foundation. My phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. How did it go with Harold? Difficult but productive, I replied. We're expanding the audit. Harold is on board. As I expected, dinner tonight to discuss next steps? 7 p.m. works, the usual place. As I walked back to my office, I passed Olivia in the hallway. Our eyes met briefly, a complex mix of emotions passing between us. In another life, we might have been enemies, the wife versus the mistress, locked in bitter combat over a man who had betrayed us both in different ways. Instead, we now shared an unusual bond. Both of us had been used by Daniel, albeit in different ways and to different degrees. Both of us were now working to rebuild our professional lives in the aftermath of his downfall. Ms. Miller, she nodded professionally, still uncertain of how to interact with me in our new reality. Olivia, I acknowledged. I heard your digital campaign proposal was well received by the marketing team. Surprise flickered across her face at the recognition. Yes, they've approved the pilot program for next quarter. Good. We need innovative thinking as we integrate the two companies. I kept my tone professional but not cold. I'll be interested to see the results. As I continued to my office, I reflected on how dramatically life had changed in just over a week. The anniversary dinner that Daniel had planned as my humiliation had instead become the catalyst for sweeping change, not just in my personal and professional circumstances, but potentially in the governance and ethical foundation of Bennett Innovations itself. The coming weeks would bring challenges as we unraveled the full extent of the financial irregularities and determined how to address them. There would be difficult conversations with regulators, potentially uncomfortable revelations about respected industry figures, and the complex task of reforming entrenched practices across international operations. But for the first time in years, I felt truly aligned with my purpose. By attempting to discard me, Daniel had inadvertently placed me in exactly the position needed to save the company from practices he and his mentor had established. Practices that might have eventually destroyed Bennett Innovations completely, if left unchecked. Sometimes, I mused as I settled back at my desk to prepare for my dinner with Thomas, the most effective revenge isn't just exposing betrayal. It's using that moment of revelation to create something better than what existed before. Daniel had given his girlfriend my position, but in doing so, he had set in motion a chain of events that would make me CEO and him a cautionary tale in corporate governance case studies for years to come. The irony wasn't lost on me. In fact, as I reviewed the preliminary audit findings Samantha had just sent over, I allowed myself a small smile of satisfaction. The universe, it seemed, had a poetic sense of justice after all. 3 months into my tenure as CEO of Bennett Innovations, I stood in our newly renovated research wing, watching as Harold Bennett cut the ceremonial ribbon. Camera flashes illuminated his beaming face as he officially opened the facility that would house our most ambitious medical research projects. The space had been completely transformed from the sterile, corporate environment Daniel had preferred into an open, collaborative setting designed to foster innovation. This laboratory represents everything Bennett Innovations stands for, Harold announced to the assembled employees and press. Breaking barriers, fostering collaboration, and most importantly, putting patients first. He turned to me with genuine admiration. And none of this would have been possible without our visionary CEO, Rachel Miller. The applause was warm and sincere, a marked contrast to the perfunctory acknowledgments I'd received during Daniel's leadership. As I stepped forward to say a few words, I caught sight of Samantha Kelly giving me a subtle thumbs up from the side of the room. Our eyes met in shared understanding of how far we'd come since that fateful night at Porter & Oak. Thank you, Harold. This facility embodies our renewed commitment to innovation with integrity, I addressed the crowd confidently. Every breakthrough that emerges from these labs will be developed with the highest ethical standards and a singular focus on improving patients' lives. What the assembled guests didn't know was that alongside this public celebration of our company's future, we were preparing for the final phase of addressing its troubled past. Tomorrow morning, we would release the completed forensic audit findings to regulatory authorities, officially disclosing the financial irregularities spanning years under Martin Green and Daniel's leadership. After the ceremony concluded and the press departed, Thomas Wilson joined Harold and me for a private moment in the new facility's conference room. "Impressive event," Thomas remarked, settling into a chair. "Perfect timing, too, establishing the narrative of Bennett's bright future just before addressing its problematic past." Harold nodded solemnly. "The disclosure tomorrow will be difficult for everyone, but especially for those who've dedicated their careers to this company. The employees deserve the truth," I reminded them both. "And more importantly, they deserve leadership they can trust moving forward." Our legal team had worked tirelessly to prepare for tomorrow's disclosure, crafting a comprehensive account of the financial misconduct we'd uncovered while establishing clear boundaries around responsibility. The documentation now ran to hundreds of pages, detailing irregular transactions spanning more than a decade and implicating numerous individuals, most prominently Daniel Miller and Martin Green. "Any word from our friends?" Thomas asked, the euphemism understanding between us as referencing Daniel and Martin. "Nothing direct, though their attorneys have been increasingly active," I replied. "They've transitioned from threats to negotiation, seeking assurances about how they'll be characterized in our disclosure." "And James Miller?" Harold inquired, referencing Daniel's father, whose offshore accounts had played a significant role in the financial scheme. "Silent, at least publicly. Our sources indicate he's liquidating assets and transferring funds, presumably preparing for potential regulatory action." The investigation had ultimately revealed a sprawling network of financial manipulation extending far beyond what we'd initially discovered. The Singapore connection to Daniel's father had been just the beginning. We'd subsequently uncovered similar arrangements in Dubai, Milan, and São Paulo, each designed to siphon company resources through elaborately constructed channels for personal benefit. Most disturbing had been the discovery of payments to regulatory consultants who had direct connections to approval authorities in key markets. While we found no explicit evidence of bribery, the pattern of payments coinciding with favorable regulatory decisions raised serious concerns that we'd been obligated to include in our disclosure. "The press conference is confirmed for 9 a.m., Thomas verified, consulting his calendar. I nodded. "Jennifer Chen will join us as board representative. We'll release the executive summary to the media, file the complete documentation with regulators, and post the detailed findings on our investor relations site simultaneously." Harold sighed heavily, the weight of tomorrow's revelations evident in his posture. Though our investigation had ultimately vindicated him, confirming that Martin had indeed falsified or manipulated documentation to suggest Harold's approval of unethical practices, the disclosure would nevertheless cast a shadow over the company he'd built from nothing. "It's the right thing to do, Harold," I assured him gently. "Bennett Innovations can't truly move forward until we've fully accounted for the past." He straightened in his chair, determination replacing resignation. I know, and I've made peace with it. Whatever short-term pain we suffer from this disclosure will be worth it to restore the company's ethical foundation. Our meeting concluded with a final review of tomorrow's logistics. As we were preparing to leave, my phone buzzed with a notification, a text message from a number I didn't recognize. Last chance to reconsider. Some doors are better left closed. Midnight deadline. I showed the message to Thomas and Harold. Daniel? Thomas guessed. The phrasing matches his previous communication, I confirmed. This would be his third attempt at intimidation. Harold's expression hardened. He still doesn't understand who he's dealing with, does he? I smiled slightly at Harold's confidence in me. Apparently not. He seems to believe I can be threatened into abandoning the disclosure. What will you do? Thomas asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Nothing, I stated firmly. We proceed exactly as planned. Whatever Daniel thinks he can reveal or threaten has already been factored into our decision. The disclosure happens tomorrow regardless of midnight deadlines or ominous warnings. As we parted ways, Harold surprised me with a brief hug. I knew I made the right choice in supporting you for CEO, he said quietly. Daniel never understood that true leadership isn't about power, it's about responsibility. Back in my office, I found Jennifer Chen waiting, a tablet in hand displaying preliminary market analyses on the potential impact of tomorrow's disclosure. Always thorough, she had prepared detailed projections under various scenarios. Our institutional investors have been privately briefed, she reported as I settled behind my desk. They understand this disclosure represents a clean break with past practices rather than ongoing concerns. Most are indicating they'll maintain their positions, though we should expect some volatility. I reviewed her projections, noting the careful balance our team had struck between transparency and stability. These look sound. The key message tomorrow will be that these issues were historical, have been thoroughly investigated, and are now being addressed with appropriate remedial measures. Jennifer nodded in agreement. The analyst call at 11 should help reinforce that narrative. Having Thomas Wilson participate alongside us sends a powerful message about confidence in Bennett's future. We spent the next hour finalizing talking points and anticipated questions, ensuring complete alignment across our leadership team. Jennifer, with her decades of experience in corporate governance, had proven invaluable during this process, her steady guidance helping navigate the complex legal and reputational challenges posed by our investigation. There's one more thing, Jennifer said as our meeting concluded. Olivia Parker has requested a private meeting with you before the disclosure tomorrow. The mention of Olivia caught me by surprise. Though she had continued working in our marketing department, our interactions had been minimal and strictly professional since the night at Porter & Oak. Did she indicate why? I asked, curiosity piqued. Only that she has information relevant to the disclosure that she prefers to share directly with you. I considered the request carefully. Olivia had cooperated with our investigation, providing valuable documentation about Daniel's misuse of marketing funds. But her continued presence in the company remained a complex reminder of Daniel's betrayal. Schedule her for 7:30 tomorrow morning, I decided. Early enough to incorporate anything relevant before the press conference, but with limited time to avoid distractions. After Jennifer departed, I found myself alone in the quieting building, the weight of tomorrow's disclosure settling over me. In the 3 months since taking the CEO position, I had overseen a remarkable transformation at Bennett Innovations, rebuilding the leadership team, integrating our partnership with Wilson Medical, launching new research initiatives, and most critically, restoring the ethical foundation that had eroded under Daniel and Martin's influence. Tomorrow would mark both culmination and beginning. The public acknowledgement of past failures and the official commitment to a new path forward. My phone buzzed with another message, this time from Samantha. Security sweep complete. All systems secure for tomorrow. Want to review the final package once more? Already doing so, I replied. Everything looks ready. Get some rest tonight. Tomorrow will be intense. I returned to reviewing the disclosure materials, ensuring every detail was accurate and properly contextualized. The document represented months of painstaking investigation, legal review, and strategic consideration. Its release would likely trigger regulatory investigations, possible litigation, and certainly intense media scrutiny, but it was unquestionably the right thing to do. My concentration was interrupted by a gentle knock at my open door. Looking up, I was surprised to see Harold standing there, having apparently returned to the office. I thought you'd gone home, I said, gesturing for him to enter. I tried, he admitted with a slight smile, but found myself too restless. Thought I might be more useful here. He settled into a chair across from my desk. Any response to Daniel's midnight deadline? I checked my watch. 11:38 p.m. Not yet, though I'm not planning to respond anyway. Harold nodded approvingly. Good. Daniel always mistook reaction for weakness. It was one of his fundamental flaws as a leader. He believed pushing people into emotional responses gave him power over them. This insight into Daniel's psychology aligned perfectly with my own experiences during our marriage. He had consistently used emotional manipulation as a control tactic, both personally and professionally. That approach doesn't work when the other person refuses to play along, I observed. Precisely. Harold's eyes twinkled with admiration. Which is why you've succeeded where he failed. You've remained focused on principles rather than personalities throughout this entire process. We sat in companionable silence for a moment, the quiet of the nearly empty building enveloping us. Through my office windows, Boston's skyline glittered against the night sky, the Bennett Innovations tower standing proudly among the high-rises. I keep thinking about legacy, Harold said finally. Not just mine, but what each of us leaves behind. When I founded this company, I truly believed we could improve healthcare while maintaining the highest ethical standards. Somewhere along the way, that vision became corrupted. Not irreparably, I reminded him. What we're doing tomorrow is restoring that foundation. He nodded slowly. Yes. Though I can't help wondering how things might have been different if I'd been more vigilant. If I'd recognized earlier what Martin and then Daniel were doing. We can't change the past, I said gently. All we can do is learn from it and move forward with greater wisdom. Our philosophical discussion was interrupted by the simultaneous chiming of both our phones, identical text messages from unknown numbers. Turn on financial news immediately. Concerned, I grabbed the remote and activated the wall-mounted television tuned to Bloomberg. The breaking news banner immediately explained the urgent message. Breaking. Former Bennett Innovations, co. Daniel Miller, arrested on fraud charges. Harold and I watched in stunned silence as the news anchor detailed how federal agents had taken Daniel into custody at his Boston residence less than an hour ago. The charges included wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy, all apparently stemming from evidence independent of our internal investigation. This isn't our disclosure, I said, reaching for my phone. Someone else has moved first. Harold appeared equally confused. The timing can't be coincidental. The night before, our planned announcement? I quickly dialed Thomas Wilson, who answered on the first ring. Are you seeing this? I asked without preamble. Yes, he confirmed. I've already called my contacts at the Justice Department. Apparently, they've been conducting their own investigation for months, parallel to ours but completely independent. How is that possible? What triggered their interest? Thomas's response was measured. They're not sharing details, but reading between the lines, it appears they received information from someone with intimate knowledge of Bennett's financial practices. A whistleblower, possibly. My mind raced through the possibilities. Our investigation had identified numerous individuals with knowledge of the financial improprieties, any of whom might have approached authorities independently. "What about Martin Green?" Harold asked, his voice raised so Thomas could hear. "Has he been implicated as well?" "Not yet, according to my sources. The current charges focus specifically on Daniel's activities, particularly those involving his father's offshore accounts." The news broadcast continued, showing footage of Daniel being escorted into a federal building, his face partially obscured, but his distinctive posture unmistakable. The anchor was now discussing potential penalties, mentioning terms that could exceed 20 years if all charges were proven. "What does this mean for our disclosure tomorrow?" I asked Thomas, already thinking through the implications. "It complicates things," he admitted. "We should proceed, but we'll need to adjust our messaging to acknowledge the federal investigation without appearing to pile on." "I agree," Harold interjected. "Our focus should be on the remedial measures we've implemented, not just on exposing past misconduct." We quickly agreed to convene an emergency call with Jennifer Chen and our legal team, recognizing that tonight would likely be sleepless as we adjusted our strategy to this unexpected development. As I ended the call with Thomas, my office phone rang, the main reception desk unusual at this late hour. "Ms. Miller," the night security guard's voice came through. "There's a Ms. Olivia Parker here asking to see you. She says it's urgent and related to the news about Mr. Miller." I exchanged surprised glances with Harold. "Send her up, please." Minutes later, Olivia appeared at my office door, looking considerably different from the confident young woman who had taken my seat at Porter & Oak 3 months ago. Her expression was tense, her normally perfect appearance slightly disheveled. "I need to speak with you," she said urgently, then noticed Harold's presence. "Privately, if possible." Harold rose immediately. "I'll wait in the conference room. You two talk." Once we were alone, Olivia sank into the chair Harold had vacated, her composure cracking further. "I assume you've seen the news about Daniel's arrest." I nodded, studying her carefully. "Were you involved?" She took a deep breath. "I'm the whistleblower. I've been working with federal investigators for the past 2 months." This revelation stunned me. Throughout our internal investigation, Olivia had cooperated, but never indicated she was simultaneously providing information to federal authorities. "Why?" I asked simply. Olivia met my gaze directly for perhaps the first time since our confrontation in the ladies' room at Porter & Oak. "When you offered me a choice that night, to either go down with Daniel or help rebuild my career, it made me realize I had agency in this situation. After giving my statement to your investigation team, I started thinking about all the documentation I still had access to." She paused, gathering her thoughts. Daniel had been careless around me, assuming I wouldn't understand or care about the financial machinations he was involved in. But I have an MBA from Wharton. I understood exactly what I was seeing in those documents. "So you took them to the FBI," I concluded. She nodded. "There were things in those files that went beyond what your team was investigating. Connections to potential money laundering operations that touched multiple companies, not just Bennett Innovations. I realized the scope was bigger than an internal corporate investigation could address." The television continued silently in the background, now showing analysis of how Daniel's arrest might impact Bennett Innovations stock when markets open tomorrow. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Why not wait until after your meeting tomorrow morning?" Olivia's expression reflected genuine conflict. "Because I respected how you handled everything, how you gave me a chance to redeem myself professionally despite what happened between us. You deserved to know before it became public that I was the one who provided the evidence for Daniel's arrest." The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. Whatever her initial motivations in becoming involved with Daniel, she had ultimately made the difficult choice to hold him accountable for his actions. a choice that would likely subject her to intense scrutiny and potential retaliation. Does anyone else know you're the whistleblower? She shook her head. Not yet. The prosecutors agreed to keep my identity confidential initially, but once the case proceeds, my involvement will eventually become public. I considered the implications carefully. Olivia's disclosure added yet another layer of complexity to our already challenging situation. Yet it also potentially provided an opportunity to demonstrate Bennett Innovations' commitment to ethical reform by supporting an employee who had taken significant personal risk to expose wrongdoing. "Thank you for coming forward," I said finally. "Both to the authorities and to me personally. What you did took courage." Relief washed over her features. "I wasn't sure how you'd react, given our complicated history. Our personal history is separate from professional ethics," I stated firmly. "You did the right thing, at considerable risk to yourself. That deserves recognition, not resentment." We spent the next 20 minutes discussing how to integrate this new information into tomorrow's disclosure. Olivia provided additional details about what she had shared with federal investigators, helping us anticipate potential areas of focus in the coming investigation. As our conversation concluded, Olivia rose to leave, but hesitated at the door. "There's one more thing you should know. The night before your anniversary dinner, when Daniel was planning to replace you with me, he received a call from Martin Green warning him that Thomas Wilson had been seen meeting with you. He knew something was happening but was too arrogant to believe you could actually outmaneuver him." This final piece of information completed my understanding of that pivotal night. Daniel had walked into Porter and Oak with some awareness of potential trouble, yet his confidence in his own invulnerability had prevented him from changing course. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "And Olivia, we'll need to discuss your future at Bennett Innovations given your whistleblower status. There may be security concerns once your identity becomes public." She nodded understanding. "I've already considered that. I'll follow whatever protocols your security team recommends." After Olivia departed, I rejoined Harold in the conference room, bringing him up to speed on this latest development. His response was thoughtful but not surprised. "It makes sense," he observed. Olivia had the access, the intelligence, and ultimately the motivation to go to authorities. And her involvement explains why the federal investigation proceeded independently of our internal audit. Our legal team and Jennifer Chen joined us shortly thereafter, and we spent the next several hours revising our disclosure strategy in light of Daniel's arrest and Olivia's revelation. The midnight deadline Daniel had imposed came and went without further contact, his ability to threaten or manipulate now severely constrained by federal custody. By dawn, we had crafted a revised approach that acknowledged the federal investigation, while maintaining our commitment to transparency regarding our own findings. The press conference would proceed as scheduled, though with adjusted messaging that positioned Bennett Innovations as supportive of regulatory enforcement, while focusing primarily on the remedial measures we had implemented. At 7 a.m., I finally returned to my private bathroom to freshen up before the day's events. The woman in the mirror looked tired but resolute, someone who had navigated an extraordinarily complex situation with integrity and determination. 3 months ago, I had sat across from Daniel at Porter and Oak, watching him smugly introduce Olivia as my replacement. Now he was in federal custody facing serious charges, while I was preparing to lead Bennett Innovations into a new era of ethical leadership. The press conference proceeded smoothly, with media attention divided between our planned disclosure and breaking news of Daniel's arrest. Jennifer Chen handled questions about the federal investigation with practiced diplomacy, while I focused on articulating our vision for Bennett's future. Harold, appearing alongside us, spoke movingly about his determination to see the company he founded return to its core values of innovation with integrity. Thomas Wilson joined for the analyst call that followed, providing reassurance about the strategic partnership between our companies and expressing confidence in Bennett's leadership through this challenging period. The market responded with remarkable stability. A brief dip in early trading followed by recovery as investors processed the distinction between past misconduct and current governance. By afternoon, the initial media frenzy had begun to settle into more nuanced coverage. Industry analysts were describing Bennett Innovations as a case study in corporate renewal, praising the decisive steps taken to address historical issues while repositioning for future growth. I finally returned to my office around 6 p.m., exhausted but satisfied with how the day had unfolded. Thomas and Harold joined me shortly thereafter, carrying a bottle of champagne and 3 glasses. "I think we've earned this," Thomas declared, expertly opening the bottle. Not a celebration exactly, but acknowledgement of an extraordinarily difficult job well done. Harold accepted a glass, raising it in a toast to transparency, accountability, and new beginnings. As we clinked glasses, I felt the weight of the past 3 months, from that devastating anniversary dinner to today's public disclosure, finally beginning to lift. We had navigated a crisis that might have destroyed Bennett Innovations, transforming it instead into an opportunity for meaningful reform and renewal. My phone chimed with a news alert. Martin Green had surrendered to federal authorities, accompanied by his attorney. The charging documents remained sealed, but sources suggested they related to the same investigation that had led to Daniel's arrest. "And so it continues," Thomas observed, reading the alert over my shoulder. "The full accounting we've been working toward." Harold sighed deeply. "Martin was my friend for 30 years before he betrayed everything we'd built together. Even knowing what he did, there's still sadness in seeing his legacy end this way." I understood Harold's complex emotions. Despite Martin's betrayal, their friendship had been real once, built on shared ambitions and mutual respect before power and greed had corrupted it. "What happens now?" I asked, looking between these 2 industry veterans who had helped guide me through the most challenging period of my professional life. "Now," Thomas said thoughtfully, "we get back to the real work of Bennett Innovations, developing technologies that improve patients' lives. The legal proceedings against Daniel and Martin will continue for months, perhaps years, but the company's future isn't defined by their actions." Harold nodded agreement. "The disclosure is complete, the partnership with Wilson Medical is thriving, and the research wing we opened yesterday is already working on potentially groundbreaking technologies. Bennett Innovations is finally back on the path I envisioned when I founded it." As evening settled over Boston, we finished our champagne and prepared to depart, each to well-earned rest after the intensity of recent days. Standing at my office window, I watched city lights flickering on across the skyline, including the Bennett Innovations Tower that now symbolized not just corporate power, but ethical renewal. My thoughts turned briefly to Daniel, spending his first night in federal custody. The man who had brought his girlfriend to our anniversary dinner and casually informed me she would be taking my position had never imagined the chain of events his arrogance would trigger. In attempting to discard me, he had instead set in motion his own downfall and my unexpected rise to leadership. 3 months ago, facing betrayal both personal and professional, I had orchestrated a plan to reclaim my position and expose Daniel's misconduct. What had begun as a quest for personal justice had evolved into something far more significant, a fundamental reformation of a company that touched countless lives through its medical innovations. The universe, it seemed, had a profound sense of poetic justice. Daniel had given my position to his girlfriend, announcing it at our anniversary dinner with smug confidence. Today, he sat in a federal holding cell while I led the company as CEO, guiding it toward a future built on innovation, integrity, and genuine public benefit. As I gathered my belongings to leave, a text message arrived from Harold. "I forgot to mention, the board approved your permanent appointment as CEO this afternoon. Unanimous vote. Announcement tomorrow. Congratulations, Rachel. Bennett Innovations is in the right hands." I smiled, feeling a sense of completion. The acting designation would be removed from my title, formalizing what had become increasingly clear over the past 3 months. I was the right person to lead Bennett Innovations. Forward, not despite the challenges we had faced, but because of how we had navigated them together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, integration issues with Wilson Medical, development timelines for our new products, ongoing cooperation with federal investigators examining the full extent of past misconduct. But tonight, I could take a moment to acknowledge the remarkable journey from that devastating anniversary dinner to this point of new beginning. Daniel had given his girlfriend my position, thinking to sideline me permanently both personally and professionally. Instead, he had inadvertently catalyzed a series of events that revealed his own corruption, restored the company's ethical foundation, and ultimately placed me in the CEO role I had earned through competence, integrity, and determination. As I left the Bennett Innovations building that night, walking toward my car in the nearly empty executive parking area, I felt not triumph over Daniel's downfall, but satisfaction in what we had built from the ashes of his misconduct. A company renewed, a leadership team united by shared values, and a personal journey that had transformed betrayal into opportunity. Sometimes, I reflected, the most effective response to underestimation isn't just proving someone wrong, it's creating something better than they could have imagined. Daniel had given his girlfriend my position, but in doing so, he had set me on the path to becoming someone stronger, more capable, and ultimately more successful than either of us had anticipated. The CEO of Bennett Innovations. A title earned, not given, through a journey that had tested and revealed my character in ways nothing else could have. The ultimate corporate comeback, built on integrity, strategic thinking, and the courage to face difficult truths, even when they threatened to upend everything. As I drove home through Boston's evening traffic, I mentally closed the chapter on Daniel Miller and our marriage. Whatever federal prosecutors ultimately determined about his fate, my own path forward was clear and purposeful. Bennett Innovations had emerged stronger from its ethical crisis, and I had found my true calling leading it into a future built on innovation with integrity, exactly as Harold Bennett had always intended. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.